Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. My name is Jonathan, and thank you to ACCA and also to INSEAD EMI for having us here today. This morning, I'm going to really kick off by thinking about some of the big disruptive trends that are happening in the market and try and give a little bit of insight around why is it happening now? Why are we living in such a disrupted and disruptive world? Well, then Manik will go a little bit deeper into the applications of analytics, and Saket will take us down the forensic path and how we can really start doing investigative work. And finally, my colleague Jimmy will talk a little bit about blockchain and the exciting applications that we have there. So to kick off, I mean, you've probably seen stats like this before, but you can't overemphasize just how much information is now available to us and more computing power that we've got access to. So, all of these billions of brains around the world and all these devices that we have in our pockets are all becoming more and more connected. And a lot of people fear that. But actually what we think is we should be thinking, not what will technology do to us. A lot of people will focus on, the robots are taking over the world, but actually, how can we harness the power of this new technology? One of the ways we like to look at it is to think about a framework around grow, optimize, and protect your business. So, emerging technology really gives us the opportunity to do all three of those things, and actually we'll touch on all elements of that this morning. So clearly now we're talking about being in the fourth industrial revolution, and this is the notion of this connected age. And at the moment, the general consensus is that we've probably connected about 1% of what could be connected. So there's 99% left to go. And if you think about that, we really have to understand we're at the beginning of this connected journey. It sometimes feels like we've been in the digital age for a long time, but we really think that we're just starting to understand it. My view is actually that we're not in the fourth industrial revolution. I think we're caught somewhere between the third and the fifth. There are plenty of companies who are still very much focused on automation. How do we just make back-end operations, et cetera, a lot more efficient? But beyond that, with the rise of artificial intelligence and some of the new technologies we're seeing, we've perhaps moved past simple connectivity into machine learning and broader applications. So this speed of change is pretty incredible. A couple of stats there that I think are worth pointing out. One is this unprecedented pace of change. You'll see there it says 35 days for a new technology to reach critical mass or critical mass adoption. So to bring that to life for you, when Apple launched the iPod, it took them 365 days to sell 1 million units. By the time they got to the iPhone 5, it took 6 hours. So in the course of a couple of generations of a product, we've gone from taking a year to taking a matter of hours to adopt this new technology. And that has big implications for us in business around our willingness to let this disruptive technology into our life. But of course, there are opportunities and threats. And we should be cognizant of both. A couple of examples here, I think. One is, there are some obvious applications of emerging technology that can help us be more efficient. So you'll see there that with things like robotic process automation, we can now automate a lot of the repeatable mundane tasks that exist in our business, finance being a prime example of where we might be able to do that. And typically, we can make savings in the 25 to 50% sort of range. Now, the good thing about these robots is they don't get sick, they don't smoke, they don't take holidays, et cetera. So we can really leverage them to make our business more efficient. There are companies who are looking at things like outside innovations. The quote there around P&G, so neighbors just down the road here, who now generate 35% of new product ideas come from outside the company. So they're using open innovation, crowdsourcing, et cetera, is really helping drive innovation. But perhaps the most shocking stat for me on this page is this one on the bottom right, which says that since 2000, 52% of the Fortune 500 has been demolished. And these are companies that haven't responded to disruption, haven't thought about how they do that. So perhaps the only real advice is that doing nothing doesn't work. We have to be at least conscious of the disruption that's happening and have a planned response. Now, we've just released some research around some megatrends that exist in the market, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there are three kind of levels, I think, that we see this at. There are primary forces that are constantly evolving and driving a lot of this change. So clearly, technology, which we'll touch on a lot today, large-scale demographic change, particularly aging populations, and then globalization, the move to big urban centers, et cetera, these primary forces are driving a number of major changes in the market. To pick up on a few, industry redefined. I would argue that most industries, or most industries, have a new set of competitors to what existed just a couple of years before. In fact, a lot of businesses probably aren't in the industry they think they're in. I mean, would you say that Amazon is a retail business? Is it a cloud storage business? Is it a grocery store now? Or is it a data and analytics business? It's probably all of those and more. But industry is fundamentally getting redefined, and the lines between industries are becoming more and more blurred. There's a rise of the super consumer. I think it's now widely acknowledged that consumers hold more power than they've ever had before. We expect companies to understand us, to know us, to give us, to treat us as an individual, to give us a personalized service. So clearly, this is where analytics comes in. The more we know about someone, the more personalized interaction we can provide, and we expect immediacy. We expect you to know what we want and to give it to us now in the channel that we want at the time that we want. So the consumers now have got all the power. Clearly, there's broader implications on things like the implication on the health industry, etc. But these are some of the mega trends that we're seeing in the market. Now, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more around the technology side and where we're seeing the main changes come through. So fundamentally, within emerging technology, we see there being three big drivers of change. And they are really around automation, connection, and cognition. So automation really being, how do we impact back-end operations? How do we transform business processes, et cetera? And how do we take cost out of performing those things? That's still a big business imperative, and there's a huge amount of efficiency gains that we still see there. On connection, now the physical and the digital worlds are getting more and more intertwined. Things like the Internet of Things, et cetera, means that physical devices are being connected to the web, and suddenly we have this emergence of huge volumes of data in the market. And we'll talk a little bit around why that's so important, but clearly this is one of the big drivers around the importance of analytics. And then finally, cognition, which is really perhaps the biggest threat, the biggest opportunity that we see now, which is as machines start talking to each other, as they start to develop natural machine learning, then we're really starting to see completely new business models emerge. And so that the notion of artificial intelligence, machine learning, advanced analytics is presenting us with a world we don't fully understand, but an enormous amount of opportunity going forward. I wanted to bring that to life for you. So when we think about digital strategy, we use those as inputs into the strategy. We need to think about how can these technologies play a role, and then we look at it from a markets view. How do we start thinking about the future consumers? How do we think about new entrants to the market? We would then look into how does your business model adapt to that, and finally, what are the performance economics, what are the metrics, et cetera, to optimize given those choices? So going back to my Amazon example, if you think about how Amazon has been able to disrupt an industry like the grocery industry, so taking in inputs around automation, cognition, and connection, if you've ever seen any videos around Amazon warehouses, their use of smart manufacturing tools, their use of drones for not only delivery, which you've often seen in them, the adverts around delivering packages, but within warehouses, the use of drone technology, et cetera, is now becoming a key part of their business. We've seen things like Alexa, this virtual assistant, now allowing people to go beyond a screen interface towards voice activation, another massive trend in the market, and learning about you constantly so that we can start to think about what you've done before and what you might like in the future. In fact, Amazon typically, about 35% of Amazon's sales comes from its recommendations engine based on your behaviors and what people like you have done before. That's a huge amount, right? And then finally, on connection, we've seen Amazon Go in the States. They have grocery stores where there's no checkout process at all. It's all processed through cardless or paymentless systems going through. We've got their Amazon Echo, the little device that sits in your home and listens to everything you say and hears everything you do and is able to connect with you. So they're really thinking about how they disrupt a market, their business model and the economics, but how they use this technology as inputs to it. Having said that, probably the biggest mistake we see with companies looking to use digital technology is to think of this as a technology problem or as technology initiatives. Many of you will have seen, there's an overused slide, there's a quote which says, Airbnb doesn't own hotel rooms, Uber doesn't own cars, et cetera. That is well known. But I think probably what's more interesting to me is that if you think about how these new entrants are coming into the market and how they're disrupting, what they're fundamentally looking at is where is there deep customer dissatisfaction and how can we apply a new business model to change that? So for example, Airbnb didn't kill the hotel industry, but limited availability and pricing options did. Similarly, if you look at Apple, it didn't kill the music industry, but being forced to buy full-length albums and not being able to pick and choose the songs that you wanted was really the opportunity that they saw. So the business model addressing deep customer dissatisfaction is the catalyst for change. How we then apply technology to help solve for that is the enabler. And this is, I think, where we've got to think when we're looking at these business problems, is that we look at the business model first, then the technology. Okay, when I first started thinking about digital and its impact on business, it was a CMO or a CIO, CTO conversation. It was marketing or it was tech. That's gone out the window. Digital disruption now impacts businesses across the board. And you'll notice finance, legal, and tax are highlighted in this as key areas that you need to consider. So for us, the digital agenda has to be a C-suite level conversation. The ownership has to be at that level. And the understanding of digital technology needs to resonate with the board as well. So even board compositions are now important in terms of thinking about how digital can play a role in business. So it really is a wholesale opportunity and imperative for business. But this is what we think organizations are really looking for when they're thinking about these challenges. So the first is the pace of change. How do you keep up with this change in technology? I mean, it felt like yesterday when we were talking about mobile and social and data and cloud, and suddenly that's yesterday's news because now it's about 3D printing and artificial intelligence and machine learning and autonomous vehicles, etc. And even with that, you think about autonomous vehicles, now when we raise that topic, a lot of people raise their eyebrows like that's yesterday's news, but I don't know anyone who owns one, do you? So it's redundant before we've even seen it live in the market. That's how quick we're changing. Fundamentally then assessing, is the business model still aligned to the purpose? Is it still fit for purpose? I think there's more stakeholders now involved in decisioning than ever before. As we're more connected, more people want to be connected and have a voice. Talent is a huge issue. How do you have talent that understands this, that can perform a role? How do we employ staff who will do jobs that we don't even know exist right now? How do we create a culture where we have continuous learning and the ability to upskill and cross-skill as we move forward, as opposed to hiring traditional functions? So talent and the war for talent is very, very real. As I said at the beginning, consumers expect immediacy. Time to market is a massive imperative. So how do you shrink that time? How do you reduce your processes and become fast to market to meet that new demand? And then finally, this idea of managing the business core whilst transforming. And the analogy that's often used there is the idea of changing the cars of a tire as you're driving it. And this is what business is being asked to do today. How do we keep the lights on? How do we keep performing as a business whilst noticing that we have an imperative to change, and we've got to do that now? And that's a real challenge for businesses. And the reality is, it's not easy. So just 3 stats. So Genpact, 2/3 of digital transformation projects fail to meet expectations. Forbes, 84% of companies fail at transformation in the digital era. And my favorite one was from Gartner, which says 88% of companies are going through digital transformation, but only 25% know why. So this is where we start to come across what we term the theater of innovation. Companies doing digital stuff when it's not aligned to their purpose and their business strategy, and then not getting the results that they see. And what we're encouraging businesses is to stop doing digital and start being digital. That means, it's got to be absolutely central to the culture of the business, and we've got to empower people to think in a new way. I wanted to touch a little bit on innovation in this environment because this whole notion of innovation, I think, can be confusing. And we hear the whole time these rally cries that we should be innovating. And typically, they say something like, Uber yourself before you get Kodak'd. And even at EY, we have slides and we have banners saying, who's going to disrupt the disruptors? So everyone knows there's an imperative, but very few people tell us how and why. And if you think about the pace of change that we're seeing, simple inventions are getting more and more prevalent. So if you look at the graph, and that's a good consulting graph with lots of lines and hard to read, but what it really says, if you look at the way that modern technologies come to the market, for us to reach critical mass, the time has got quicker and quicker. So television took decades, the tablet took a few months to reach kind of mass adoption. So there's more and more inventions, they are now inputs into our business. But if you look on the logos here on the right-hand side, can anyone spot the odd one out? Any ideas which one that might be? Manik, you've seen this presentation before. The answer is LinkedIn. And the reason is all of those other businesses were invented in the last 10 years. So these brands, and LinkedIn is something like 15 or 16 years old. But if you think about things like Netflix, if you think about things like Spotify and Uber and Tesla, we think of them as just core to our life. We all know them, but they didn't exist over 10 years ago. They're all within the last decade. And that's how quickly new companies who come in with a disruptive business model can impact our lives. So clearly for us, this notion of agile innovation becomes important. Things are changing quickly, industries are being redefined. How do we allow ourselves to take an iterative approach? How do we manage a portfolio of innovation? How do we accept failure? Perhaps actually the hardest one. You hear about it in business the whole time. You fail forward or fail fast. How many companies do you know that actually allow you to do that and have that embedded in their culture? This is a fundamental cultural challenge for business today. But this whole idea of a portfolio approach is also interesting. So typically what we see is that 70% of investment in companies in innovation sits in this light grey square that we would term sustaining innovation, which basically means we'll make today's products better than they were yesterday. So the same market, same product, we're just going to improve it. And so typically there, it's small incremental change. 20% of investment is placed in adjacent innovation, which would be we will take our product to a new market, or we'll take a new product to our existing market. So it goes beyond the current scope of the product and pushes the boundary. But the really disruptive space is new product, new market, new customer. This disruptive agenda only gets 10% of the funding. But when you look at the impact, the returns, typically sustaining innovations drive very small incremental return on investment. Typically 10%. So 70% of investment goes in for 10% upside. And you can see how the ratios are inversed. So the most disruptive, the disruptive area, which has the least investment, has the opportunity to give us the biggest returns, and yet we don't invest there. And typically throughout the year, we'll see as budgets get cut and we're struggling to meet plan or other pressures come in the business, we suddenly see that investment portfolio, that allocation coming down. And you guess the first 10% that gets knocked off, that's our disruptive innovation bucket that goes. It's not 10% of the 70 because it represents the most risky part of the portfolio, and businesses typically get rid of risk first before they get rid of core. So this is something that I think business needs to consider when thinking about innovation. How do you make sure you have a portfolio, and how do you protect that disruptive area, which by its nature is more risky and more long-term? Okay, so I just wanted to finish off by giving some principles before I hand over to Manik. And these are 6 things that I think apply across industry that just will help guide us when we're thinking about this transformative, disruptive age. So the first is outside in from every perspective. We've said that the customer has become front and center, but the reality is that very few companies go out and speak to their customers. If you are launching a new product or a new service or a new offering, I'd really encourage taking in that customer view, going out and spending time researching and speaking with customers, outside in from every perspective. Second one is purposeful culture. I mentioned the notion of the theatre of innovation before, but if we don't align the activities we're doing to purpose and to strategy, then we're really just playing with digital. We are doing digital, we're not being digital. We need to make sure that we have a purposeful culture and we understand the impact of the activities we're doing on that purpose. The third one I've touched on already, which is holistic business perspective. Let's not give this to the marketing or the IT folks and hope that they'll solve digital. This is the whole business imperative. Business-led, technology-inspired. So we've touched on that again. It's about the business model change and then how we use technology to enable it. Embracing risks. And this is one that I think is something that really needs to be looked at. How do we genuinely get out of our comfort zone and allow our business to take risks and to benefit from failure and then take it forward? And then probably the most important for me is this notion of pencils for pens. We can't write in ink now a business strategy for 5 years down the line. by its nature, we have to have a plan, we have to have a direction, but I think we need to give ourselves the ability to write that in pencil and to adapt as we learn. So to not get stuck or not to fall in love with a plan, but actually have the ability to test it and to iterate from it. So that notion of writing things in pencil rather than pens is perhaps the most important. So hopefully that's set the scene a little bit around the environment, and now I'll hand over to Manik to talk about the application of analytics in that context. Thank you.